September 1st, 1939. Two decisions were made that would change the course of World War II. One started the war, the other would end it. Early that morning, Adolf Hitler sent his Wehrmacht crashing into Poland. German panzers rolled across the border as Luftwaffe bombers darkened the sky. Europe had plunged into its Second World War in a generation. Several hours later, several time zones away, President Franklin Roosevelt made a quiet announcement. He has selected a new Chief of Staff for the United States Army. The name surprised almost everyone. General George Catlett Marshall. Not the obvious choice, not even close. Roosevelt had bypassed 33 more senior generals to pick him. 33 officers who technically outranked Marshall in seniority, who had waited longer in line, who believed the position belonged to them by right of service time. Major General Hugh Drum, the favorite for the job, had held almost every top position in the Army below Chief of Staff. He had been recommended for the position repeatedly since 1930. His supporters were shocked. His allies were furious. Marshall was practically unknown outside military circles. He had spent most of his career in staff positions, planning operations, organizing logistics. He had never commanded troops in actual combat. He was 58 years old and had only made brigadier general 3 years earlier. But Roosevelt saw something others missed. Marshall had integrity. He spoke truth to power. He didn't play political games. During one meeting with the president, Roosevelt asked Marshall if he agreed with a proposal. Marshall said, no. He explained exactly why it was wrong. Roosevelt's advisors were horrified. You didn't contradict the president like that. Marshall didn't care. He wasn't there to tell Roosevelt what he wanted to hear. He was there to tell him what he needed to know. Roosevelt chose Marshall anyway, or maybe because of it. When Marshall walked into his new office on September 1st, 1939, he inherited an army that barely deserved a name. The United States Army ranked 19th in the world, behind Portugal, just ahead of Bulgaria. Total strength, 190,000 men. The New York City Police Department had more officers than the entire United States Marine Corps. Equipment from World War I still filled the warehouses. Rifles were in short supply. Tanks were scarce. The Army had trained with wooden rifles and trucks labeled tank during recent exercises. It was, as one observer put it, all bone and no muscle. Marshall looked at this skeleton force and saw an impossible task ahead. War was coming to Europe, probably to America eventually. When arrived, the United States would need an army 10 times larger than what existed. An army of 2 million men, maybe more. An army that could fight mechanized warfare against the Wehrmacht. An army that didn't exist. And standing between Marshall and that army were hundreds of officers who would never be able to lead it. The problem wasn't disloyalty, it wasn't cowardice. It was age, exhaustion, and obsolescence. The Army ran on a seniority system that promoted officers based purely on time and service. You didn't advance because you were good. You advanced because you were patient. Because someone ahead of you died or retired. Officers could spend 15 years as a captain, 20 years as a major. Colonels in their 60s commanded regiments they could barely keep up with. Marshall himself had been a colonel in World War I. After the war ended, he was reduced to his peacetime rank of captain. He spent 15 more years before becoming a colonel again. More than 1,000 officers of appropriate age and experience for lieutenant colonel were still captains in 1939. They weren't stuck because they had failed. They were stuck because the system didn't promote based on ability. It promoted based on waiting. Some of these officers were brilliant. Others were mediocre. Many were simply too old. In their 50s and 60s, set in their thinking, trained to fight the last war. They knew cavalry charges and trench warfare. They didn't know blitzkrieg. They didn't know combined arms operations. They didn't understand that warfare had fundamentally changed. Germany had just demonstrated what modern war looked like. Poland fell in 4 weeks. Tanks broke through defensive lines. Dive bombers destroyed supply columns. Infantry couldn't keep up. Cavalry was slaughtered. Everything the old officers knew was obsolete. And Marshall needed to build an army that could fight this new kind of war. In October 1939, 1 month after taking command, Marshall spoke bluntly to his staff. The present general officers of the line are for the most part too old to command troops in battle under the terrific pressure of modern war. Most of them have their minds set in outmoded patterns and can't change to meet the new conditions they may face if we become involved in the war that started in Europe. He was describing his own officer corps, men he had served with, men who had dedicated their lives to the army, men who would be utterly destroyed by modern combat. Marshall didn't enjoy saying it, but he needed Congress to hear it. He needed Roosevelt to understand. If the army went to war with its current leadership, it would lose. Marshall had a plan. He had been keeping notes for years. During his time as assistant commandant at the infantry school at Fort Benning, he had watched hundreds of young officers go through training. He noted which ones showed promise, which ones thought creatively, which ones could handle pressure, which ones led men well. The legend says he kept a little black book with names of officers he believed in. Whether the physical book existed or not, Marshall definitely kept mental notes. He knew who the talented officers were. The problem was getting them into positions where they could actually lead. In the spring of 1940, Germany launched its attack on France. The Wehrmacht broke through French lines at the Ardennes, supposedly impassable terrain. Panzers raced to the coast. France, which had held off Germany for 4 years in World War I, collapsed in 6 weeks. The British barely escaped at Dunkirk. The German military machine looked unstoppable. Congress suddenly became very interested in what Marshall had been saying about preparedness. The Second Supplemental Appropriation Act of 1940 passed. Buried in its provisions was a change that seemed technical but was revolutionary. It eliminated seniority as the sole criteria for promotion. Officers could now be promoted based on ability, based on performance, based on whether they could actually do the job. Marshall moved immediately. He established what became known as the Plucking Board or Removal Board. 6 retired officers headed by General Mahlon Craig, Marshall's predecessor as Chief of Staff. Their task was simple and brutal. Review the efficiency ratings of older officers. Focus particularly on colonels in their 60s approaching retirement. Determine who could withstand the rigors of combat command. Weed out the ones who couldn't. Marshall's instructions to the board were explicit. Critical times are upon us. Only today's performance matters. Past peacetime records were irrelevant. Medals earned 20 years ago didn't matter. What mattered was one question. Can this officer lead men in combat under the terrific pressure of modern mechanized warfare? The board went to work. In the first 6 months, they removed 195 officers, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels. Men who had served for decades suddenly found themselves forced into retirement or discharged from active duty. Ultimately, over 500 colonels were removed from service. More than 1,000 officers in total. Some were Marshall's friends, men he had served with for years. It didn't matter. The Army needed leaders who could fight the war that was coming, not the war that had already been fought. The service papers accused Marshall of getting rid of all the brains of the Army. Veterans organizations protested. Some officers claimed it was a purge, an unjust removal of dedicated soldiers. Marshall didn't respond to the criticism. He just kept removing officers who weren't fit for what was ahead. Not everyone was cut. Colonel George Patton was 54, right in the at-risk age category. But Patton had the energy and drive of a man half his age. The board noted his physical condition, his tactical brilliance, his aggressive mindset. Patton stayed. Others like him stayed. The board wasn't removing officers because they were old. They were removing officers who couldn't adapt, who couldn't learn, who couldn't lead in modern warfare. Marshall was gambling everything on this purge. If he was wrong, if the officers he removed had been capable, he would be remembered as the man who gutted the Army before its greatest test. If he was right, he would save thousands of American lives. There was no middle ground. And in the summer of 1941, Marshall would find out if his gamble would pay off. By June 1941, the Army had grown to nearly 1 million men. The first peacetime draft in American history had brought in hundreds of thousands of recruits. National Guard units had been federalized. Training camps sprawled across the South. New divisions formed every month. The expansion was staggering, but quantity didn't guarantee quality. Marshall had soldiers. Now he needed to know if his officers could lead them. Lieutenant General Leslie McKnight, Marshall's director of training, proposed a solution. War games. Massive field exercises that would simulate realistic combat conditions. Test the doctrines. Test the equipment. Most importantly, test the officers. Put them under pressure. See who could handle command. See who cracked. 3 major exercises were planned. Tennessee maneuvers in June, Louisiana maneuvers in September, Carolina maneuvers in November. The Louisiana exercises would be the largest. Nearly 500,000 troops, more soldiers, than in the entire Army just 2 years earlier. 50,000 vehicles, both wheeled and tracked. 32,000 horses, because the cavalry still existed. They would fight across Louisiana and East Texas for 3 weeks. 2 armies battling for control of the Mississippi River Valley. Marshall told MCN what he wanted. I want the mistakes made down in Louisiana, not over in Europe. And the only way to do this thing is to try it out. And if it doesn't work, find out what we need to make it work. The maneuvers were unscripted. Unlike previous training exercises where everything followed a predetermined plan, the Louisiana exercises gave commanders full flexibility. Plan your operations, execute as you see fit. Umpires would grade performance. The Army would learn from what happened, and Marshall would watch his officer corps under battlefield conditions for the first time. Lieutenant General Ben Lear commanded the Red Army, representing Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, and Kentucky. He was a hard-nosed disciplinarian, hot-tempered and abrasive. His troops didn't like him much, but he was competent. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger commanded the Blue Army, representing Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee. Kruger was stern, demanding, but fair. He was described as one of the Army's best educated and most perceptive officers, At 62, he was in superb physical condition and among the first to understand the possibilities of armored warfare. The exercise began on September 15th, 1941. Within hours, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a typical training event. The scale was unprecedented. Entire towns found themselves in the middle of military operations. Soldiers bivouacked in fields, on roadsides, anywhere they could find space. Supply columns stretched for miles. Communication systems upgraded from previous exercises still struggled under the load. Senior commanders had to be near the front this time. Marshall had insisted on it. Where to? Commanding from comfortable headquarters, far behind the lines, Colonel George Patton commanded the 2nd Armored Division, assigned to Kruger's Blue Army. What happened next would become legendary. In the second phase of the exercise, the Blue Army was ordered to attack Shreveport, defended by Lear's Red forces. The Red Army had strong positions, prepared defenses, anti-tank units in place. A conventional attack would be costly and slow. Patton didn't make a conventional attack. He led his armored division on a flanking maneuver that covered nearly 300 meters, racing through East Texas in a massive end run around the Red Army's positions. He bought up every gallon of gasoline at every country service station in East Texas to keep his tanks moving. His reconnaissance units captured part of Barksdale Airfield, knocking the Red Army's air support out of the exercise. Patton's tanks came roaring into Shreveport from the north, while infantry and cavalry units attacked from the south. The Red Army was trapped. On September 28th, with the climactic Battle of Shreveport about to begin, headquarters stepped in and halted the exercise. The Blue Army had completely routed the Red forces. The war game was over. Marshall and McKnight observed everything. They took notes constantly. Which officers excelled? Which ones struggled? Which ones showed innovation? Which ones froze under pressure? Colonel Dwight Eisenhower served as Chief of Staff for Kruger's Third Army. Eisenhower's planning was thorough. His execution was precise. He coordinated operations across massive distances with multiple divisions. Journalists covering the exercises noticed him immediately. CBS reporter Eric Seed said Eisenhower makes more sense than any of the rest of them. Drew Pearson, one of the most prominent journalists in America, wrote that Eisenhower conceived and directed the strategy that routed Lear's 2nd Army. He had Pearson noted a steel trap mine, plus unusual physical vigor. Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel. In peacetime, under the old seniority system, he might have stayed a lieutenant colonel for another decade. Marshall noted his name. Lieutenant Colonel Omar Bradley also performed well in Louisiana. Noted Lieutenant Colonel Mark Clark, who had planned the entire exercise using a gas station roadmap, showed tactical brilliance. Noted Colonel Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell executed a blitzkrieg-style attack with a flying column of tanks during earlier 1940 maneuvers. Noted these weren't the senior generals who had dominated Army leadership 2 years earlier. These were younger officers, many still colonels, who understood modern warfare instinctively. They grasped what the old guard couldn't. Speed mattered. Maneuver mattered. Combined arms operations mattered. The Louisiana maneuvers proved Marshall had been right to remove the dead wood. The officers who remained and the younger officers now rising could actually fight the war that was coming. The maneuvers also revealed problems. Communications needed improvement. Anti-tank doctrine needed refinement. Supply systems broke down under the strain. Infantry struggled to keep pace with armor. Some units used horses that collapsed from exhaustion and had to be abandoned in the field. The exercises showed that mechanized reconnaissance was far superior to horse cavalry. Divisions that had the option chose purely mechanized units every time. Marshall absorbed all of it. These were the mistakes he wanted made in Louisiana, not in combat. The Army would learn, it would improve, it would be ready. On December 7th, 1941, just 2 months after the Louisiana maneuvers ended, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war. The Army Marshall had been building would be tested for real. The officers he had purged would not lead American soldiers into combat. The officers he had promoted and identified would. What happened next proved Marshall's purge had been necessary. Eisenhower, the lieutenant colonel who impressed everyone in Louisiana, was promoted to brigadier general in October 1941, just weeks after the maneuvers. Within months, Marshall brought him to Washington to head Army operations. By late 1942, Eisenhower commanded all United States forces in Europe. He planned and executed Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, then Operation Husky in Sicily, then Overlord, the D-Day invasion, the largest military operation in history. Eisenhower rose from lieutenant colonel to 5-star general, commanding millions of soldiers in less than 5 years. It never would have happened under the old seniority system. Eisenhower would have been stuck waiting for colonels ahead of him to retire. He might have made general by 1945, too late to command anything important. But Marshall's purge opened the path. Ability mattered now. Performance mattered. Results mattered. Bradley went from lieutenant colonel to field commander of American forces in Normandy. Patton, who survived the purge and excelled in Louisiana, commanded Third Army and became the general the Germans feared most. Stilwell commanded Allied forces in Burma and China. Clark commanded Fifth Army in Italy. All of them owed their positions to Marshall's willingness to destroy the old system and promote based on merit. Less than 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter Short were removed from their posts in the Pacific. They had failed. Major General Frederick Martin, Short's air commander, was also relieved. When Lieutenant General George Kenney took over Army Air Force's operations in the Pacific in mid-1942, he immediately removed 5 generals he deemed deadwood along with 40 colonels and lieutenant colonels. The Marshall system was now standard. If you couldn't perform, you were gone. Marshall estimated he forced out at least 600 officers before the United States entered World War II. Hundreds more followed during the war itself. The purge never stopped. Every time an officer failed, Marshall replaced him. The Army's officer corps became ruthlessly merit-based. The temporary promotion system created unlimited advancement for those who produced discuss and summary dismissal for those who couldn't. Critics might say Marshall was harsh, brutal even, but the numbers tell the story. When Marshall became Chief of Staff in 1939, the United States Army had 190,000 soldiers. By 1945, it had 8.3 million. That army conquered Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan simultaneously. It fought across North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, the Philippines, and dozens of Pacific islands. It won because it had leaders who could adapt, innovate, and execute under pressure. Leaders Marshall had identified, promoted, and empowered. At the war's close, the British Chiefs of Staff called Marshall architect and builder of the finest and most powerful army in American history. Winston Churchill called him the organizer of victory. Bernard Baru called him the first global strategist. President Harry Truman said Marshall was the man who won the war. Marshall's purge had worked. Not because he removed incompetent officers, though he did. Not because he promoted brilliant ones, though he did. It worked because Marshall understood something fundamental about warfare. The tools change, the tactics evolve, the technology advances. An army that refuses to adapt dies. An officer corps that values seniority over ability loses. Germany proved this in 1939 and 1940. They had reinvented warfare with blitzkrieg. Speed, shock, combined arms. Poland fell in weeks. France fell in weeks. The old methods didn't work anymore. The officers who couldn't see that, who couldn't adapt, who couldn't learn, became liabilities instead of assets. Marshall saw this clearly. He had watched American officers in World War I struggle with outdated tactics and poor planning. He had seen thousands of soldiers die because their leaders didn't understand modern warfare. He wasn't going to let that happen again. So he purged. He removed. He promoted. He built an officer corps that could fight the war that existed, not the war they wished existed. The Louisiana maneuvers were his proving ground. The place where theory met practice, where plans faced reality, where officers showed what they could do under pressure. Some excelled, some failed. Marshall noted all of it. The officers who performed went on to command armies. The officers who struggled went into retirement or administrative positions where they couldn't get soldiers killed. It was harsh. It was necessary. And it won the war. After the war, Marshall continued to serve. He became Secretary of State under President Truman. In 1947, he proposed the European Recovery Program, known ever after as the Marshall Plan. The program that rebuilt Western Europe, that created the economic conditions for democracy to survive, that prevented Soviet expansion. For snorts, this work, Marshall received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953, the only Army general ever to receive that honor. But Marshall's greatest legacy isn't the Marshall Plan, it's the Marshall System. The idea that leadership positions should be filled by the people best qualified to do the job, not the people who have waited the longest. That ability matters more than seniority. That results matter more than time and service. That an organization's survival depends on its willingness to remove people who can adapt and promote people who can. The lesson Marshall taught in 1939 remains relevant today. Organizations face constant change. Technology evolves. Methods improve. Threats shift. The leaders who thrived in previous conditions might not be suited for current challenges. The choice is simple. Adapt or die. Promote based on merit or lose based on obsolescence. Marshall made the hard choice. He purged. He promoted, he rebuilt. And when the greatest test came, the army he created was ready. The stiff officers he chose won the war. Every battle, every campaign, every theater. From Normandy to the Rhine, from North Africa to Berlin, from Guadalcanal to Tokyo Bay. American forces prevailed because Marshall had the courage to remove the leaders who couldn't lead and promote the ones who could. On September 1st, 1939, Roosevelt made a decision that shocked the Army establishment. He picked an officer 33 ranks down the seniority list, an officer who had never commanded troops in combat, an officer whom most people had never heard of. Roosevelt picked George Marshall. And Marshall spent the next 6 years proving that merit matters more than seniority, that ability matters more than credentials, and that an organization's willingness to change determines whether it survives or dies. Marshall's Purge saved the American Army. It created the officer corps that won World War II. It established principles that still guide military leadership today. And it proved that sometimes the most important decision a leader can make is deciding who shouldn't lead anymore.